Good morning. So we're going on to our second day. So what is the plan for today? We are having this lecture here, and then there is a buffer time between the lecture and the lunch. If any of you would like to ask some questions about the product one, you're welcome. And then we meet again at 1 o'clock to see a documentary, which is a very inspiring documentary, and I think that's quite important to take a look at. So I hope to see you all here at 1 o'clock. And then after the documentary, shortly, we would have 15, max 30 minutes conversation about that documentary. Okay, and then you guys are free to go to your workrooms. And then if you need, we can go through the workrooms to talk with you. Probably yesterday you saw the place that you have, you know, the E102 to 03, 4, 5, I think. And those places are booked for you the whole course. So I think you could do something that probably would be smart to already divide that. So 5 groups, the first 5 groups stay in anyway, you can divide by yourselves. And the idea is that through next week, we're going through, Sarah and I, we're going through those group rooms to talk with the groups. Okay? That's written on this, also in the schedule. Plus in the afternoon, also after the documentary, we're going to talk briefly about the study trip. Okay? So basically it's that. So we are starting now is to talk a little bit about sustainable planning. We don't have anything for changing, do you? Do we? No. Yeah. Sorry, that's just a sec. And that doesn't go up. It's supposed to go. Oh, it does. Oh, that's fantastic. That is bad for you guys? No? Are they okay? Okay. Hey, can I stay here in front of you like that? Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about sustainable planning, and I do hope we have a good dynamic like we have yesterday. So you guys are very welcome to ask me questions. When I ask you something, you are very welcome to also ask me something. And when you guys want a break, you just tell me, okay? But the idea is to have, if we talk more than 1 hour, max 1 hour, and then we have a break. I think that's very helpful, okay? So a little bit of context. I'm very sure you heard about that, but we have this curve which became an inflection on the 20th century about urbanization. So if we take the 1800, only 3% of the population lived in cities, which is quite impressive. Do you know anybody that do not live in a city? Can you raise your hands? Okay, that's quite a lot. Can you tell me where is that person living?
He's living on a farm with his parents outside a city.
Okay.
1 hour from there.
Yeah, that's quite a lot, in fact, when you raised your hands. But it's true. I think it makes sense because if you see in 2000, we made the shift. Not in 2000. I think it was in the 2000s. We made the shift that more than half of the population on Earth start to live on cities. But we still have a lot of people living in the countryside. Of course, countries like Denmark, in Europe in general, countries are quite urbanized. So you have a minority of the population living in not urbanized areas. Approximately, I think between 15-10% of the population that lives in farms and places like that. But of course that has a big impact on society, but also in the job market. Because if people live in cities, we do need urban planners, engineers working to make those cities to work, right? And most of the population now are living in those places. And if you think in terms of urban planning, it's a relatively new profession in the way it looks nowadays, and also in terms of the demands that the profession has. So if you think about the 20th century, most of the demands were about how to provide homes to the population and make the cities more efficient in terms of move and transportation. Those were the main discussions about cities in the 20th century. And the 19th century was very much about health hygienic issues. How could we make our cities more clean and healthier? And then when we have this turning from the 20th to the 21st century, we start to raise that question about sustainability, which has a very systemic approach about cities, and we should think about not only the environmental dimension, but also the economic and the social dimension. So nowadays in the whole world, we have from 75, not nowadays, in 2050, we're going to reach approximately 75% of the population living in cities. That figure here, it's already reached by European countries, as I said before. But if you take the global south and also the north, global north in Asia, things are changing very fast. And a lot of consultancy companies in Denmark, they do work with Asia, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, providing urban planning projects for those countries because there is a big demand of changes. If we do think about big changes in Copenhagen, compared with other larger cities in the world, they're not that big. But the good news is that a lot of companies, based not only here in Copenhagen, but other cities here in Denmark, they work a lot with foreign projects, helping those local governments and also national governments to plan the expansion of those cities. That's just a different graph, but showing the same figure. So the large circle with the large diameter shows the Earth population, and the smaller diameter, the red one, shows the urban population. And then you can really see how the balance between rural and urban has been changing through the time. So the world that we live nowadays is quite different from the world that our parents, our grandparents, they lived. That's just a graph showing this big inflection that we have in the world population. So the world population really started to boom during the industrialized time, but especially in the late 19th century, 20th century. But together with this growth of the population, we also have economic prosperity. Our world is much more prosperous than it was before, and that has a lot to do with cities. And there is a reason why people also move to cities, where you have much more opportunities, economic opportunities, but also social opportunities. But together with all of this, we also have an inflection of the emissions of CO2. So if in the old days we said that the emissions were much related to chimneys of industries, nowadays the emissions are very much related to our activities in our cities. All kind of activities that we do relate to transportation, but also our consuming, the lifestyle that we have in our cities. So that's something that we definitely should take in consideration when we think about the design of new districts. And then talk a little bit about your project that's going to be at Niveau Station. You're going to have a lecture with a guest lecture about transit-oriented development. We also mentioned about that a little bit yesterday, and that's one of a quite relevant approach when you want to think about a healthier and also sustainable way to design cities and to plan cities. So to also think about in a integrative and integrated way between districts and transport systems. So something that's quite interesting is that, of course, we're talking about the Danish context, which is very important, and there is a lot of demand for urban planners, engineers in the Danish context. But as I said before, a lot of companies, they do also work with foreign countries. If you take, well, most of the major consultancy companies working with urban planning, like Arup, Covey, and Rambo, they have headquarters everywhere. So, but we can see the biggest cities are not here in North Europe; they are everywhere. And something that's interesting is that growth is very fast, and we don't clearly know what is going to be the impact in the environment and the way people live, and how people are going to live in the long term, how that could be. And that's a big challenge. There is a term that we work with at Mobility, call it travel behavior. So it's very important for an engineer to foresee and build up scenarios how people are going to behave in the city. And that has very much to do with what kind of infrastructures are provided for these people to move around, the density of those cities, and then people are going to make their choices, how they're going to move around from dot A to dot B. And then just a very short example of changes and how things are changing very fast. And this example is not that new, in fact. So if you see that landscape and the way it became in 2005, that's 81, and the way it became in 2005. Those are radical changes, you could say. We saw also that in Orsted, in one way, right? This is 81, and that's 2005. This is 94 and 2005. And one more. So there is this speed of change, and that speed is very fast. And if there is one constant thing, is that change is accelerating more and more. Our cities are changing too fast. And most of the time they're changing without planning, without analysis and an investment and a proper approach for this growth. So most of the world will have a growth that's uncontrolled and unplanned. And of course that has a very negative impact in the life of the citizens. So in this state of continuous flow, if we see those changes, those fast changes, what is going to be what you could call the predominant urban condition. So what would be this urban condition? How people would live? Probably you guys have been traveling around a little bit and you saw different urban environments, and we can see something like that maybe is a little bit more European inspired, but we see a lot of that in the world, and that's probably nowadays you see much more constructions like that happening than something like that. You also see a lot of poverty and people moving very fast for those cities. So a big question that we have is that will the urban planning tools we have prove sufficiently inclusive and adaptable to allow us to address, influence, or plan the changes to our urban environment in positive future directions? Are we capable to influence those changes in the urban environment or not? And of course that question has to do with a lot of aspects, and the economic aspect has a huge role on that. Even when we talk about urban planning interventions in Copenhagen, they have to do a lot with the economic aspect. You know, at the end of the project, the budget, it needs to be blue, it cannot be red. How can you do that? And then I'm sure you know the Brundtland report, which has that notion of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then we have this quite traditional graph where we have this economic, social, and environmental approach. How we can have these three pillars together, and when we do a proposal, including a proposal in NIFO, how can we think about these three dots? So if you're going to do a change in a project at NIFO, how can we have economic sustainability in this project? If you're going to put money there, how can we get money back? And then when I say we, mostly the public authorities. Most of those urban planning projects, they are run by public authorities. And then there is this social aspect. So, and that has a lot to do with diversity and inclusion of people with different incomes, but also people with different backgrounds. And then we have the environmental approach. We do need to think about nature aspects. So how is the biodiversity in that place? How is the flora and the fauna in that place? How can we preserve that, or even more, how can we improve that? We can also think about CO2 emissions or greenhouses gas emissions. How can we make people emit less than they do with their habits? And then here I bring one a little bit more complex graph that maybe you should take that in consideration when you work with NIFO. It's not for now, that's only for 2 weeks, but Arup uses that graph to assess all their projects. Do you want to say something?
No,
No, please. No?
No, it's just, no, it's not.
Okay. But if you guys want to say something, please do it. But I think it's very important, and you don't need to use that. Most of the companies, they have their own assessment tools. And all the projects, they pass through these assessments to control the quality of the urban planning projects. So I think it's very important when you make your proposition that you do use some kind of control tool to see how much your project is answering different aspects that we need to take in consideration to consider a project a sustainable project. Yesterday we talked very briefly about the DGNB. That's also a tool that you can use. In fact, it's a tool that a lot of different companies and clients they use to get a stamp. That's an internal tool. And something that's quite important to be said, like a building, also in terms of urban planning, you're not going to solve all the problems and have excellence in all the dimensions. You need to choose what is in the foreground of your project and what is in the background. Of course, you should have a systemic approach, but you need to be quite smart to say what it is in my foreground. What are those dimensions that I'm going to really come with an excellent answer? And I'm going to show today this project called Bonolit. Do you know this project in Malmö? Do you know the Torso? Yeah. How do you call that neighborhood? Well, I call Bo from Living. BO hyphen 01. Bo 08. Yeah, maybe my Danish is not that good. Maybe no, it's not. But anyway, that project is a project. It was sold as a sustainable project, which I think is quite fair. There is a lot of quite interesting solutions. But what they had as foreground was the water cycle. And I'm going deeper on that a little bit soon. And then they also took in consideration a lot of other aspects, but the water cycle was really the big star of the project, because we are just not able to solve all those problems in such a complex system, which it is an urban environment. You have so many variables, we are just not able. There are a lot of things that we do not control. And then I'm showing this picture here with different habitats. So you have here some savanna, tundra. You have different kind of habitats. We have here 9 systems that we have in Earth, and there are a couple of other ones. And then we have here a map that probably you saw in your geography classes in high school. The tundra, temperate forest, all kind of things, the Amazon forest. And then we see here the urbanized world. But then I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from cities located in quite different habitats and environments. So as you saw here, we have, for example, tundra is so different from the desert and also very different from the tropical forest. Is that right? If you think in terms of environmental demands or system, they work quite differently. And then you have Cairo. That's the cityscape of Cairo. That's the cityscape of the planning of Cairo. And that's the cityscape of Lagos, which is a completely different habitat from Cairo. Cairo is very dry. It's on the riverscape, but you have a lot of, it's a desert climate. Lagos is completely different. Very wet. It's another story. Closer from the equator. And then you have Sao Paulo with 1 million inhabitants in a temperate climate. And then you have Shanghai, New York, London, Lagos again. Anyway, do you have any comments about that? What I just said now? Yeah?
Most of it looks quite similar.
Sorry?
Most of it looks quite similar.
Exactly. Yeah.
And maybe that's not so great, because then you don't really need meet the requirements of the climate. If, for example, Laos is very wet, then it might not be the greatest idea to have buildings very close together or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think your answer was great, and complementary with, probably we don't have answers for each spot of that. But what we can see here, that the modern architecture, this is in London, that's Canary Wharf. That was designed in the 80s, was built through the 90s and 2000. So the new financial district. New York, that's also quite central area of New York, of the Empire State. Shanghai, that's a whole new area of Shanghai. This is old downtown Sao Paulo. Well, old for Brazilians, not for Europeans. The new downtown changed of spot. But if you think through the 20th century and 21st century, most of the urban planning and architecture that we build around the world It's quite similar. It's not that different. Of course, there are some exceptions. And that has a big impact in the environment and also the way people live and the life quality of people. And we need to change that. So I know, and that's not a folk story, but I know some projects, housing projects that are copy and pasted in some areas in Asia. There is such a huge demand that you just copy and paste. So you don't take in consideration the topography, which is something very important, right? So, and topography is an amazing thing. You can do so many things with the topography, the hydrography of the place. There are so many local aspects and also cultural aspects that we should take in consideration that most of the time we don't even have the time to do that or the money to hire somebody to do that. And that's a big problem. And we're also coming back to know-how today at that lecture. Then you're going to see how you should be careful with what is pre-existent there. Natural things, but also man-built things. Just see the time. Yeah, and then I'm going now to have this not that short introduction. I'm going to talk about 3 different subjects that I think is quite interesting to take in consideration in an urban planning project. So this graph here shows how it's a graph much focusing American cities, but shows that most of the water, in fact, is rainwater run off to the drainings. So 70%, that's quite a lot, right? And probably you guys have experienced in Copenhagen some flooding. Have you? Any of you? In the last summers. For example, in Vesterbro, in the underground, a lot of buildings, they have water in the underground in some areas we cannot pass through. So that's a big challenge, how to design, take consideration the water system, the water cycle as a role. And rainwater is a big issue nowadays, especially in a context of speedy changes in the climate and climate change. We have more and more severe weather. And that severe weather is quite challenging because it's not that we have severe weather all the time, but you have those punctual days with very severe weathers that impacts a lot the whole urban system. This is, for example, a project in Los Angeles, a regeneration of the major river in Los Angeles that you have concrete all around. And the whole idea here with this project is to make an adaptable design for the different level of severe storms. So this is just, there were a regular day in the riverbank, sorry. That's a 2 years storm. So you have the waters going up a little bit. That would be a 5 years storm, and that would be this 100 years storm. So the idea is that also you design in a way that you create some flexibility. Some parts of the public space of that square or a green corridor can be flooded when you have those severe storms, and that's not going to create a major problem for the city. How can we do that? In Copenhagen, we are trying to do a lot of things like that. Anybody has an example? Yeah? Yeah? I think Nørreport is. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Der er de her cykelstativer, der er sådan i en ledig fordybning, hvor der så er afløb.
Ja, ja.
Hvor vandet så kan samle sig der, i stedet for at få kørt fingrene.
That acted. And in fact, it's a quite smart design, in the sense that we're supposed to visit Nørreport, but we are not doing it because it's too many things. But the idea was to go in there to show that whole design from Northport Station. And that bike parking is really smart because, first because what you mentioned, what is your name? Caroline. Because you said, I think that's quite a smart thing. And like the park and play or play and park that we mentioned yesterday, that facility, this bicycle park facility has two uses, not only one. It works both for parking, but also for receiving, draining the water, and that's quite smart. And the second thing, the way it's designed, I don't know how much you have been walking around the Northport Station, but it takes in consideration that thing that we mentioned yesterday about the desire lines. The way you walk there, it's very smooth and very intuitive to cross all that square. You know, the bike park is not just standing in the front of your way and need to go this or this way. It's made in a way, they before made the design, they made a lot of mapping, how people walk around that area. And then they locate the bike parking in between the desire lines. And that's such an important thing. When you design a bicycle park, it needs to be as close as possible from the access of a metro station or train station. That's the first thing. And also, we should not make trouble with the desire line. Last semester, I went with my students to visit Flintholm Station. You were there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And was so interesting because we took a look at the bicycle parking, and there were a lot of bikes there. However, there were even more bikes just to get with the staircases and the lift. So people intuitively, they just want to make their connections and their intermodality as fast as possible from one point to the other. So that's something that you also need to think when you're going to design Niveau Station. There is a car parking there and there is a bicycle park there. So how can you make this connection between these different modes as smart as possible, okay, for the user? So the challenge that we have is try to make this picture here looks like that. Maybe not looks, but to work like that. You know, through design in very dense areas, urbanized areas. How can we do that? And there are a lot of techniques and different kind of pavements that we can use on the roads, etc. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about da Liga in Malmö. Probably now you know it when I show that picture, right? Is there anybody from Malmö here? No? Or from Sweden? Really? Okay. Who have been here in that place? Just to have an idea. Anybody would like to say very few words about it? I would appreciate that. Anything? Yeah.
Well, I had to do it in Rhino on my first semester.
Okay.
Actually, and it's very unique because I don't know how to explain it properly. It's like a rotating, as you can see on the picture.
Oh, you draw the torso,
yeah,
not the
turning,
whole
yeah,
neighborhood.
the turning torso.
Yeah.
It's made of a lot of, I want to say like puzzle pieces, like stacked on top of each other, rotating a certain degree each time in each section. Very fun to make, very fun to design.
It's quite impressive.
Yeah, it's quite
because all this vertical circulations just your work and the plans and even with the torsion, right? You brought another subject, but I think that's also quite interesting. This project designed by Calatrava. Do you know him? Anybody knows Calatrava? He's a Spanish designer, and his office is really specialized mostly in transport infrastructures. So, for example, in Lisbon, in Sevilla, he has a lot of projects, especially in South Europe. He's quite famous there. But something interesting about this project and this tower is part of what I call monolith. So even though you see that tower standing there alone, if you see the skyline, and it's very different in terms of architecture from the rest, there is an urban planning project that decided to put that tower in the middle of these buildings. And do you guys have a guess why? Any guess? Doesn't need to be just, yeah.
Diverse population, maybe?
Yeah, I didn't think about that. It could be, yes. Diverse population, also diversity of aesthetics. Yeah. Anything else? That's very good. Yeah?
Like a growing population problem, like they need to fit a lot of people in one space, so you tend to build taller buildings.
Yeah.
Exactly, this stuff doesn't have necessarily to do with the visual style, but usually when you build such tall buildings, it's because you want to grab a lot of people in one space.
Yeah, density. That's great. Yeah. Anything else? I think those 2 points are very important. And for sure, it has to do with density and also diversity. Even though it's very expensive to live there. But it is diverse because it's a different lifestyle. So for example, a lot of families, they prefer to live with kids, they prefer living houses. So you have people with different lifestyles. But something that was also very important was in terms of branding. And maybe that sounds a very different subject from urban planning perspective, but branding is something very important for urban planning. So when you do big investments and big changes in a city, you also think about the image of the city and how that can be profitable to that city, how that city can attract investments, attract new citizens to live there, how that city can be attractive. And Malmö passed through very problematic economic times. Probably you know about that. It has a lot of, the figures from Malmö were not really good from the 70s, 80s, 90s. The city lost all its industry, has a lot of social issues, and also in one way, after the opening of the bridge, it became part of Great Copenhagen. So it became a little bit of a shadow of Copenhagen. So part of the changing and the transformation of Malmö was to build what they call monolith. And what is monolith? Is how to live in the 21st century. That's the idea. So Malmö would like to be the biggest example of lifestyle in the 21st century. And more than that, they decided to build the biggest housing tower in the whole Europe. So it's a kind of a lighthouse. Also showing up in the skyline how the city is important. So there is also a lot of intentions behind the skyline of an urban planning project. And then you can think about different scales, but also different importance or on the hierarchy of different areas in the city. If you're going to work with Nivo, and the title of the project that we're going to do in Nivo is Sustainable Hub, we need to make that the Nivo station stands out and becomes important on the cityscape of that neighborhood. Of course, in a quite different scale. But what I want to also show here is about the water planning. So all the water cycle is visible in monolith. If you go to the backyards of the buildings, but also if you see the pavement, all the design is made in a way that you see how the water runs off through the different pavements and through the different surfaces. Also, most of the material and the open spaces are made in a way that the water, they are more capillary. You have more permeability, so the water can go through the soil. The same with the roofs, a lot of green roof. This is also a flooding park, so this area can be flooded during a storm. And then when you walk through, you see a lot of those draining structures, and they are visible. And the idea here also that it should work in terms of water cycle, but also we, users of that space, we should be conscious that there is water there. How many rivers or how many drainings we just don't see? We are not conscious that there is a lot of water happening underground on the facades with the pipes, and we just don't see that, and we are not conscious how the water is present in our daily life. And the idea of this project that the water, to solve the problem of the water, but also the users and the people that live there, they know that. And that's, for example, a facade. All the pipes that runs water, you can see that on the facades. So the project really stands for that. That's the foreground, to treat the water cycle. That's another example of the facade. Yeah, just a few more pictures. I'm going to upload those slides, so if you want to take a look carefully in the pictures. When you talk about diversity, social diversity, you can see, for example, there are houses with backyards, there are apartments, there are towers, there are different kind of apartments for different kind of families. You can have a single person, you can have a family with a mother and a father with a lot of kids, two fathers with a lot of kids. You can have all kind of things. That's another draining. Yeah. And now we have a 10 minutes break. Okay, guys? Thank you.